So I've fallen considerably behind in terms of reading out blog posts and then putting these onto YouTube. So again, like I've already done on my YouTube, I apologise for falling a bit behind with this. What with the work for the course and the stresses and strains and work involved in getting ready for attending a conference for the first time, I let things slip. So this is me trying to improve that. So this is a transcription of a blog post called Speaking Out, and I'll read it as I wrote it, beginning now. This constitutes a redrafted form of a piece of writing I had considered worthless. That I had considered the worthless speaks of the very oppressive systems which limit our ability to speak of ourselves within an intersectional framework. Ourselves are of no worth within an academic framework which seeks to silence us and to take upon itself the model of the correct way to theorize. Speaking out is an act of rebellion. Why read theory when we are hungry? Reading with and through bell hooks and Hélène Cixous. This is a narrative of my first exposures to critical theory. This is not a narrative confined to academic settings. This is a narrative which is set in trains, in the waiting rooms of gender identity clinics, and in the dark corners of public houses, which constituted some of the few places where I and those like me were told explicitly that we were safe. This is the narrative of theory as liberation, as the measuring out of my and others' confinement in the search for a way out. In teaching to transgress, education is a practice of freedom, bell hooks states that I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around me and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw that in theory then a location of healing. Hooks 1994-59. I was desperate, I was hurting, and I came to theory and found a way to understand the forms of violence that surrounded me. I found in theory a way to become the subject of my own analysis. Theory allowed me to move beyond the condition of living under the sign of the unlivable, Butler 1993-8, and create a space in which I could be, in which I could live. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. Theory gave me the tools to fashion an identity which stood in opposition to that forced on me as a genderqueer person, an identity enforced by medical gatekeepers who withheld treatment for those who were not deemed to be performing their gender properly. Butler allowed me to understand that gender is an ontology without a core, an ontology sustained through its performance of a series of fabrications manufactured and sustained through corporeal signs and other discursive means. Butler 1990-185. I was being asked to enact and enforce a boundary which constituted me as other, as non-subject. Butler gave me a way to form an identity which forsook a sense of the normal. Butler 1990-189. To ask what kind of gender performance will enact and reveal the performativity of gender itself. Butler 1990-189. And to enact my own subversive performance of gender. For people living with oppression, theory becomes not an abstract tool, but a way to name our pain and to theorize from that location. Hooks 1994. To read in hooks of a woman found release in theory, and to tell Hooks that before this point there was so much hurt in me, Hooks 1994-73, is to see myself finding a model for not only the pain but the radical possibilities that had been formulating within myself. To reiterate, theory gave me the tools which allowed me to understand I was living within a system of oppression, and the tools to critique these systems, to escape their control and form a stable sense of self which sits in opposition to them. Theory gave me life. There is a tension in the examination of my own relationship to theory. This tension arises from moving from a discussion of self to a discussion of others. A critical understanding which frees me but not others fails to fulfill the radical requirement. Freire 2017-24. Freire identifies as a central component of liberation the need of the systems that create oppression to be overthrown. This is something I've tried to do in my life, the real lesson of critical theory, and something that I knew before I read Freire. As Bell Hooks states, when our lived experience of theorising is fundamentally linked to processes of self-recovery, of collective liberation, no gap exists between theory and practice. Hooks 1994-61. The separation of theory and praxis only exists if we see theory as a discrete process which comes into being by the process of naming and learning. Hooks 1994, 61-62. But, as Cixous makes plain, we are in the burning bush. We are born in the burning bush. We are nailed fast by a fence. Cixous 2005, 16. To exist within systems of oppression is to be ensnared with or without recourse to theory. Theory is not a practice which occurs within academia and which academics must somehow find a way to translate into action. With the academy is a process and a way of being which liberates us as both individuals and as a collective. It is a process and a way of being which allows us to see that we are constructed and to call to those who would oppress us and demand that they acknowledge the seams and sutras in yourself. Stryker 2011, 86. So that's the text. There are some footnotes. So after I first mentioned Bell Hooks' name, when I say the title of her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, I argue that, and I quote, in both the body of the text of this chapter and in my references, I've chosen to respect the form Bell Hooks asks for a name to be written in. I feel that there is a degree to which I must apologise for being a white academic using her writing without reference to the community she specifically addresses. This would be compounded by misrepresenting her identity. So that's the first reference, the first footnote. The next one is when I say I was desperate, I was hurting, came to theory to find a way to understand the forms of violence that surrounded me. I found in theory a way to become the subject of my own analysis. And this has a quote attached to it by Judith Butler. This exclusionary matrix by which subjects are formed thus requires the simultaneous production of a domain of abject beings, those who are not yet subjects, but who form the constructive outside of the domain of the subject. There's the third one when I discuss fear, and I say the radical requirement that fear identifies as a central component to liberation. the need for the systems that create oppression to be overthrown. This has a more lengthy footnote, and I quote her. I'm reminded of an act of radical liberation pedagogy. I was unemployed and applied for a temporary loan while waiting on benefits. Knowing I would spend hours in this process, I took a copy of Gender Trouble with me to read again. While waiting with a group of women, one asked why I was reading, and when I told her, she asked what it was about. I explained Butler's theory, and this sparked a truly radical conversation, which resulted in several of the women vowing to change how they brought up their children in response to Butler's work. Theory is not a tool of the oppressed Theory is rather a tool of the oppressed to achieve liberation, and that any theory that cannot be shared in everyday conversation cannot be used to educate the public. Hooks 1994-64. And there's one more. So when I was speaking about the separation of theory and praxis, I spoke about the process of naming and learning. And I'll quote the footnote for that. Of importance here is Hooke's observation that the act of naming is a privileged act which may obscure what's really taking place and can be said to constitute part of the structure of white supremacy. Hooke's 1994, 62-63.